España.
Somos Dorian y Piedad.
Hola a todos.
Hola.
Soy sacerdote.
Me da muchísimo gusto darles la bienvenida.
Llegamos a 2000 familias todos los días.
Quizás todo lo que hacemos es tan solo una gota en el mar, pero el mar no sería lo mismo si faltara esa gota.
Servir a los demás es nuestra prioridad.
Ha sido fundamental el trabajo y la labor del equipo del Banco de Alimentos.
Tenemos por séptima semana consecutiva la canasta familiar. ¡Vamos!
Estamos con la satisfacción de que la misión de hoy se cumplió.
Estoy eternamente agradecido con ustedes.
Buenos días para todas las personas que nos
Good morning for everybody, everybody that's with us from the Global Food Banking Network. We welcome you to this conference. We are going to be talking about the future of Latin America. And to begin with, I would like to introduce what we've done during 2019, the results, what we've done, and the work that we've done in 2019. First of all, in the world, globally, we have food banks and national networks in 44 countries. In 2019, we served almost 17 million people through 56,000 beneficiary organizations. This allowed us to deliver over 919,000 tons of food that were distributed to vulnerable populations. In Latin America, we also did very important work. We have 205 food banks, 4 national networks in 17 countries. During 2019, we served 4.6 million people through more than 11,000 beneficiary organizations, and we deliver more than 226,000 tons of kilograms to vulnerable populations in those countries in the area. Out of all the work that was done, these over 900 banks that we have globally, the Latin American network, and the work that we've done in Latin America represents 25% of the kilograms distributed and people served. They represent 27% of the total population that was served through the global food banking network. However, we've been here working with the pandemic. We've all lived this. This is the first time ever. This is a major crisis that touches not only everybody else, it touches us personally and professionally. By doing this work, we had to do a huge effort and work with all the food banks, serving almost 1 million people, additional people. Additionally to those that we served in 2019, we also had to raise the services to the beneficiary organizations. That went up 72%. Right now, 100% of our food banks have received more requests for both support and service to serve new populations. And due to the pandemic, we've been able to we have had to change the distribution method so that we continue serving the people that we work with. 77% of our food banks have had to purchase food in order to satisfy the local needs of their vulnerable affected populations. So that is the work that the food banks have been doing in the framework of this pandemic. And however, even though it's true that we are beginning to live a new normal in how we're managing with COVID-19, the social and financial crisis we're living is not going to wait for us. We have more and more people, according to the data that we're going to hear in a little while in Latin America, we have gone back between 10 and 20 years in terms of poverty and food access and all of that. That's why we have Laura Ripani. She is the main specialist in labor markets for the Inter-American Development Bank, and she's going to talk to us about the impact that COVID has had in the Latin American market. We also have Octavio Sotomayor here. He works with he's the Economic Affairs Officer in the Division of Natural Resources, and he's going to talk about the new possibilities for the food banks. And then we're going to close with a presentation by Ricardo Rapallo, who's the Food Security and Nutrition Officer with the FAO in Chile. And that is his area, Latin America and the Caribbean. And he's going to talk to us about food security in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's going to give us the new numbers and the new challenges in the environment of COVID-19. We thank them all for their presence. At the end of all three presentations, we're going to read some of the questions. We're going to hopefully provide some answers. Some of them hopefully will be there. I invite you all to ask questions throughout the presentations. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for your presence. I'm going to invite Laura now so that we can start with her presentation. Hello, good morning, everybody. Anna, thank you so much for your invitation. I'm Laura Ripani. I'm the coordinator of the Labor Markets Division in the IDB. I'm going to talk to you then. I'm going to share my screen so that you can look at my brief presentation. I will be here at the end of the presentations so that I can answer your questions. It will be a pleasure to answer them. Okay, can you see my screen? Can you? Yes, we see your screen. We do. Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean area. This is the short agenda for today. This is a short presentation to talk to you about the pre-COVID-19 situation, where things were when the COVID-19 pandemic started in terms of jobs. I'm going to then talk about the impact of COVID-19 on jobs and income. Once the pandemic is here, we're going to see what's happening now. And I will finish by giving you 3 keys to the future. That's very important both for government, for public policy, and also for every citizen. So in terms of the pre-COVID-19 situation, I'm going to talk about the informality in employment, unemployment, and low productivity. The unemployment was not a serious problem in the region. The numbers were not that high, even though before COVID-19, there were certain countries and certain groups of people, certain populations that were more affected by unemployment. Among them, young people, especially in the Caribbean, and many times women and other disadvantaged groups in the labor markets. On the other hand, one of the conditions in the region we know well is the high level of informality. Job informality. And then lastly, the low productivity compared to other regions of the world. That is something that has been stagnated, and there is low productivity. And lastly, there is a lot of unequal access to employment opportunity. On the one hand, there is no creation of good employment opportunities, and there are huge differences on who has access to these employment opportunities. So just to give you some numbers, this reflects what has been happening in the last 20 years in Latin America and the Caribbean. We see average, we have 7% of unemployment in the region. As I said before, it's not a very concerning number, but there are economies that do have much higher numbers. For instance, in the Caribbean, we see that at the end of these 20 years, it is almost 10% unemployment there. And then you have some other countries that do not have such high level of unemployment, for instance, Central America. In terms of formality, yes, the numbers are really concerning. Like what we see, the average, which is that black dotted line in the middle, formality in the region average is about 42%, 42% that work in the formal sector. What this means is 58% of people working informal jobs. This is worse in, for instance, the Andean countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and also Central American countries. These are countries that have the highest levels of informal employment, informal work. In the Caribbean, for instance, the informality levels are not that high. They're about 20%. And this is something that has been maintained. It's very stable throughout the last 20 years. In terms of productivity, as we mentioned in the beginning, this is a very serious problem in the area, the very low productivity levels. And we see in the last few years that the levels of productivity have gone up, but very, very slowly. They're really stagnated compared to other areas in the world. And the dotted red line on top, those are Asian countries. The black solid line is Latin American and the Caribbean. So you can see that the productivity levels are the lowest in the world right now. So what has happened? We get the pandemic, and this has really had an impact on jobs and income in Latin America and the Caribbean. As we well know, it has had an impact on both employment and jobs and income. The unemployment that we see right now, and this is something that we're seeing throughout the world, not just for Latin America and the Caribbean, we are seeing unprecedented unemployment levels. As we said before, it didn't used to be a huge problem, but now it is. And this affects, again, mostly those sectors that were already suffering problems in the employment area. So informal workers, low-income informal workers are the most affected. On the other hand, there are support programs, but the fiscal problems in the region and the low ability of the states and the governments to fight this aggressively in terms of being able to protect their population with transfer programs and other programs, their efforts have not been enough to resolve the existing problems. And then after COVID-19, good employment opportunities will be scarce. So there will be a very slow recovery time when we're going to have very few opportunities for employment. In terms of the numbers, what the International Monetary Fund shows, they did some research in April about what was going to happen in 2020 in the region in terms of GDP. And in April, they say it was going to be a 4% drop of GDP. They revised the numbers in June, and they see that the number is much larger. So they're talking about 9.4% drop in GDP. It's a huge drop. So you can imagine this is a huge blow to the economy in the region. The Inter-American Development Bank, what we see is a number of possible cases, loss of formal employment. What we see is it depends on what kind of scenarios we're facing in the future. If this is a short-term crisis, which is the most benign scenario, which is not that benign because this is 2 times the crisis of 2009. The destruction is 5 million people will lose their formal jobs. If the recession is prolonged, this can reach 17 million people. So the possible cases are really troubling, and we'll see what happens. And these scenarios vary a lot by country. Looking at countries like Argentina, we see, for instance, according to the scenario, the loss of formal employment could be up to 5%. Whereas if we look, for instance, countries like El Salvador, this could reach 24%. And many other economies will be facing these huge numbers of job losses as well, depending on the scenario and the prolonged recession that they may be facing. So the IBD, what we thought it would be very important to have a dynamic tool to do an analysis of the labor market and the impact that COVID-19 has on the job market. So we created this observatory. It's a labor observatory. I'm going to give information so that you can go in and see what we are reviewing in this observatory. But this is a screenshot of what the observatory is showing. So on the top portion, you can see that we have job losses. There are news on jobs. We reviewed like media, social media. We look at the openings, where the job openings are in the country, in the region. And for instance, for Argentina, on the left side of the screen, we see there was a huge drop in April 2020, and that's Social Security workers. That means formal workers. And just to give you a couple more numbers about what the observatory is doing, this is based on the numbers that the countries are sharing and what impact it has on employment. We see that the drop in Brazil, for instance, is 4.8%. This is the difference between February and April 2020. And the other important thing that we need to remember, and we see informal sector has been 3 times more affected than formal sector, formal employment. So if we look at the cities, the metropolitan areas, those have been really the most affected sectors during this pandemic, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but throughout the world. We see that the drop in employment has been a lot worse. We see Lima, metropolitan area, there was a drop in employment that was as high as 25% from February, March, and April. And as part of this world of job losses, companies with 1 to 10 employees were the most affected, 36% loss of employment. Women have lost more jobs, young people and people with low levels of education, and all the different sectors have been affected in the metropolitan area of Lima. You have construction, manufacturing, services, trade, everything has been hit. Construction even more so than the others. So I'm going to finish the presentation just giving you 3 keys for the future. These are 3 important things that we need to think of as a way to work with the effects of this pandemic. One thing that's really important, we have to create good opportunities of employment, good employment opportunities to improve this global balance, to be able to expand access to existing job opportunities. And on the other hand, we need to make sure that these good job opportunities are quality jobs. And you know, people need to be able to face all these risks that we all face throughout our lives. There is the risk of poverty in old age, health risks. And then we need to rethink and close the gap between those people that have a higher level of education, more education, and try to move more people from informal jobs to formal jobs. And in general, try to close gaps. In a region and that, as we all know, is one of the most unequal places in the world. So we need to really try to close these gaps in employability. And in the productive sectors, lastly, we need to rethink the productive sector in the region. We know that there will be opportunities in terms of the global value chains. There will be ways of positioning the region and to try to occupy a much more important space in the future. Many companies in Latin America and the Caribbean have to work on this. There will be a reorganization at the global level in terms of global value chain. And Latin America and the Caribbean has a lot of talent and they have a lot of room for growth and they really can position themselves very well in this new world with this new balance. So we really have to support all companies so they can go through this transition, they can manage this transition, give them the tools so that they can introduce technologies and those companies can become more competitive and they can increase productivity, which is one of the biggest areas that they need to work on. So with these first few thoughts, I'm gonna leave you in Octavio's hands now. He is going to make the second presentation. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Laura. And I want to greet you. And I would like to thank the Global Food Banking Network for this invitation. I'm going to ask Anna to help me with the slides. I apologize if something doesn't work. Perfect. Honestly, as I said before, it's an honor to be here with you today. This is a very, very difficult time. I'm going to try to be fast. If we can move to the next one. Well, the presentation is what we have here. We're going to give you some context, some reference to the actors, Then we're going to talk about what's going on right now, the crisis alerts, their effects on the food systems, the opportunities for food banks. I'm gonna dare give you my opinions, positive conclusions, hopefully. And the context, I think that we all know it. We are dealing with the financial and health crisis extremely hard. We were coming from a very slow growth period. 2020, with everything that's going on, I'm going to try to explain it to you in a minute, but it is very clear that poverty will grow in 2020, and we have different crisis alerts, of course. We have vulnerable workers, we have rising food prices, we have declining nutritional quality. These problems, especially the ones that I'm going to be talking about, we see them in the Caribbean, we see them in Central America, we see them in the dry corridor, Haiti, Venezuela, at the most vulnerable. And it's also important to talk about what governments have done, and what they've done is really insufficient and fragmented. So we, right now, the food banks continue to work, and that's something that we need to recognize. What are the channels through which COVID-19 affects the region? Basically, we at ECLAC identified the different channels, 5 channels. One is the decrease in the economic activity of its main trading partners in the region. Then there is also the drop in commodity prices. There is the interruption of the global value chains. There's also the problem for tourism services. This has had a big impact in some regions, some countries in the area. And finally, there is a worsening of the global financial conditions. If we can move on. What has been the reaction? I think the first thing, we are living in an unprecedented time of crisis. That is the first thing. Is the first systemic crisis of the century. And I'm going to show you a document. The UN published this. Probably Ricardo is going to talk about it as a member of the FAO, but we want to make sure that this crisis should not become a humanitarian crisis and a food crisis, but it will. It's important to mention that ECLAC and FAO have made several approaches, or have created several approaches. Some of the details are here. I don't want to give you too many numbers here, but it's important to point out that ECLAC has presented the need to have a basic emergency income for everybody. Then we have analyzed the possibility of applying like a food bonus or a food bond. Some countries are already doing this through different mechanisms. The other important thing here is we want to have a financial reprogramming, which means you want to have companies open, maintain employment. And finally, ECLAC and FAO have presented the need to give like a productive investment bond or bonus. And something else that's important, we were talking about the food supply chains. They have continued to function throughout. They have had some problems that I'm not going to detail here, but in general, they have maintained their functioning. And so the supply is still there. It's present. And as I said before, the governments have taken different measures to support both households, maintain income, emergency income, things like that, the food subsidies, and then also reprogramming, protecting businesses and promoting their continued functioning. So what else is going on? The first thing is you can see a clear increase in poverty. And I think that the numbers speak for themselves. A month ago, we estimated that there was going to be a delta of 16 million people in extreme poverty due to the pandemic. And a couple of days ago, our executive secretary updated this information, and you can see the numbers now. You can't see it on the screen, perhaps, but I don't know if you can see it clearly. But from 16 million people, conditions have worsened clearly. I think we're going to go to 84 million. And from 84 million, we're going now up to 96 million people in extreme poverty. So this is due to these health crises that this is happening. So this are just the rural and urban numbers. I don't want to waste any time talking about it. You have them on the slides. And this 83.4 million people that face the risk of hunger in 2020, you have the different categories, and I'm going to move on. You see the numbers. And I think there's another important factor that you have to take into account, and the measurements that we have done when you measure the IPC. This goes up faster than the general IPC, especially in the beginning of the crisis. It has become more stable now. Now, you can see there the international pricing, and there's a drop of prices. You see the main groups of basic products with some exceptions, but there has been a decrease in prices in general. And lastly, also we have the problem of the national currencies and devaluation. This pushes inflation up, and this also has an impact on the price of food. So what are the effects on the food system? First of all, the effects on the system. This crisis is a palpable reality. This has a huge impact on both urban and rural households. And I was impacted by, I was listening to a conversation in Peru by rural leaders, and they were talking about 2 million people that have left the big cities, especially Lima, and they have sort of taken refuge in the rural world now. So in the rural areas in Peru, and this may be applicable to Latin America, there is a lot of pressure on these rural areas because they have received a lot of people that moved out of the cities. The civil society has activated, as you well know. They play a very, very important role. There is a lot of experience that they have, and within that framework, to me, it's very clear that the food banks are going to play and are playing a critical role. I think it's very important, and I'm going to try to talk about it. You need to remember that at least in the area of public policy as it pertains to the agricultural sector, and this may be different from the urban areas, there will be very few fiscal resources to invest in the rural areas. Very low availability of fiscal resources. And what is very clear is that we may start a cycle of systemic crisis that we may see coming up in the coming years. There's climate change, for instance, and that's something that we need to remember if we can move forward. So how is this crisis going to change the food systems? I think the main thing is it changes the perception about the vulnerabilities of the food system. It redefines the concept of food security in terms of the strength and resilience of food supply chain. That becomes a very relevant factor. This questions the relationship between society and nature. And we have to really move forward to more inclusive, more environmental models. It makes more visible the role of family and indigenous agriculture, and it values the attributes of food goods. There is the issue of quality and seal of origin is perception of food goods that are associated with the new sensibility of consumers to this type of distinction. It's important to think that this crisis opens up an opportunity for businesses. Consumers will value those companies in terms of how these companies react uh, when facing this crisis. I mean, that has to do also with digitization of agriculture. And this crisis reveals that it is key to have a country project and to have a good system of public policies, including the civil society, and reaffirms the importance of international coordination. And, well, to finish up, the food bank opportunities. I dare give my own opinion here, trying to come up with new ideas. And obviously, what I'm going to say now, and the premise here is food banks play a critical role. Uh, in ECLAC, we have a very high concept of the work that food banks do. Why? Because food banks imply participation of the civil society, and in particular, business participation. That is really important. And additionally, there is the realization and the impact. Food banks have a huge direct impact, and I don't want to spend too much time on that right now. Now, talking about uh, how to work on this reflection, I would like to mention to you, I believe this crisis probably should lead to a change in social responsibility. CSR, I would call it 2.0. Something that goes beyond philanthropy or shared value. What Porter and Kramer mentioned. Philanthropy or share value are extremely important. I'm not saying otherwise, but it's important to talk to the companies about social responsibility that has evolved, where the main thing is this commitment that they have with the collective strategy so that we can prevent new systemic crisis. That is one thing that we need to start thinking. Number two, how to reach these businesses, these companies. I've been looking at the work that you're doing. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we know that we have to increase the volume of food that is distributed among the vulnerable sectors. We need to work with more companies. And I just wanted to add that in the urban world, there is a huge potential, and I'm going to dare make a couple of comments about what could happen with agriculture. I think you know this very well. In terms of primary production, these are, there's huge numbers of food that is wasted. These are the numbers here. And if we can move on, and I'm about to be finished. So what I wanted to mention to you has to be with the extension of functions, or what I call extension of functions. The evaluation that I did of the work that you're doing, what you see is that you are advancing, you're extending, you're going from food into other areas. You do diapers, toiletries, and the types of products that are being transferred go beyond just food. So this is a new hypothesis, and this is something to be explored. But I think that perhaps we should go beyond in the future, look at the possibility of transferring assets, productive assets, not used by the different businesses. For instance, supplies that you may be talking about equipment, tools, firewood, infrastructure. And this is something that we need to explore more in detail. But in the end, the idea is that eventually we should use these non-productive assets that the businesses are not using. And if we can look at the next one. So transfer these assets, these supplies, this equipment, maybe go from associations and have like a compact, a contract by which the different associations, the partnerships, farmers can transfer directly to the vulnerable homes, for instance, people that are in the small towns, in rural areas, or transfer directly to the food banks. Uh, those agricultural products that you have in the farms, things that are going to be wasted, and have like a new model of business, something win-win that allows strengthening the work that you're doing. I'm not sure I'm making myself very clear here, but I think there are existing synergies here between these businesses, the food banks, and the agricultural world. And with Anna a couple of days ago, we were talking about it, and she has a lot of experiences of working, especially with the agricultural sector. But I think there is a new way of working here that eventually could sort of empower the work that you're doing. And I will end with the conclusions here. I'm sorry. And just by letting you know that you're doing an incredible job, very important work. I see things are very complicated. There are very low resources. The civil society plays a critical role too, and we need to extend or expand coverage. You do this very well. I don't know how you can recruit new companies, but we need to. The third thing is how to establish these win-win partnerships with the agricultural sector. And the food banks should help solve the investment deficits in these poor areas. And finally, and I said it before, this idea of collaborating to fight poverty in the rural areas and increase in productivity and to work with the most affected areas. This is my information. These are some details about what I'm proposing to do, some of the material that you can read, and don't want to talk too much more. I want to give the word to Ricardo Rapal.
Thank you very much, Octavio. Thanks, Laura, and the network for inviting the FAO to participate in this very interesting conversation related to the food situation in Latin America and the Caribbean and the roles that food banks can play here as they are just trying to face this new situation with the COVID pandemic. Octavio has already presented some very thought-provoking ideas. I'm sure you're already discussing those, you're implementing them in some countries, but I think they are very stimulating. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that 2 days ago, the annual report on food safety and nutrition in the world was issued. This is different organizations of the United Nations, and they usually try to report on the progress or lack thereof on food security in the world. And this year, as you can see, they continue discussing the need to change food systems so that healthy nutrition is more accessible to everybody. I'm not gonna spend too much time on the data because thanks to Laura and Octavio's presentation, I think those things are clear. Obviously, the news is not that good. It wasn't good before the pandemic, so you can imagine what we're going to be living through for the next few months or years. So I just have to, unfortunately, to confirm that bad news. Latin America was not on a good path in reference to the indicators of hunger and malnutrition. And it doesn't seem that we will be able to achieve the objectives of food security and nutrition in the 2030 agenda. Obviously, the COVID pandemic is a threat that affects the possibilities of this being achieved. And we are not on the right path either to reach all the goals related to malnutrition and all its aspects, not only hunger and food security, but also the issues of obesity. So the trend wasn't good. You can see the numbers here. For the last few years, hunger had increased. This last year was an increase of 10 million in 1 year, almost 60 million in 5 years. So Latin America, even though it was a developing region that had done things relatively well until 2014, 2015, but now we can see an increase of food insecurity, an increase of hunger, and as we will see also other forms of malnutrition. Here you can see it by sub-regions, Latin America, the Caribbean, Central America, Middle America, South America. So that's where you can see the millions of people who are undernourished. Obviously, the pandemic complicates everything. Everything becomes more of a dire situation in relation to the malnutrition indicators. We know that you're living through that. We're facing that. We have seen the complex situation that we're living through in all of the countries of the region, with even more complex and more severity in the cities, in an area that's more and more urban. And we include, of course, all the mid-sized cities, all of those, and this affects all the groups whose economic dynamics depend so much on cities. The forecast, and it's pretty preliminary, but we will suffer a larger increase of those levels of hunger and food insecurity. Obviously, there will be a recovery process, but we will end up in a situation that's worse than what we had lived through. We are going to see that the pandemic could add 83 to 132 million people to the hunger ledger. But the measures that are taken to stop the dissemination of the virus, it depends on that and the effect that this will have on the economies. Now, food insecurity is more than just hunger. You live through that. When we talk about these other indicators of food insecurity and hunger, we're not talking about just serious or grave food insecurity. It's not that they're facing a serious situation for lack of food, but there's another characteristic of Latin America, what we call moderate food insecurity. People who are not in that situation where they can't eat today, but they nevertheless live in constant uncertainty about what they can guarantee for their family stable day by day. Even that takes them to a situation where they don't eat 1 day of the week, or it affects also the quality of the food they eat. So in Latin America, hunger is present. There's another type of hunger that expresses itself with other ways of malnutrition, that chronic hunger that affects children's growth. And another expression of this is obesity and being overweight. We see a high correlation between the levels of extreme poverty and the quality of the food people eat, how that results in the increased weight of children under 5, and also in adults. It could be a manifestation of this poverty and food insecurity. Also in Latin America and the Caribbean, unfortunately, we are at the top worldwide with the levels of obesity. So in this part of the presentation, my report this year is calling attention to the fact that it's important not only to eat, but it's important to eat well. There's an estimation of what the cost could be of a healthy diet, or at least compared to a diet that's enough only in calories term, we can see that a healthy diet is 60% more expensive than a diet that just basically provides for nutritional needs. It could be even 5 times more expensive than a diet that at least satisfies the energy needs. And in Latin America, the cost of these diets is it's above the world average. In certain regions like the north of Latin America, which are, we could say, are more developed. In Latin America, it is expensive to eat well. And this is shown in several maps. The report provides more detail, but we can say that about probably 104 million Latin American Caribbean citizens cannot afford a healthy diet. Their level of income is so low that even if it were physically available, they would not be able to acquire this healthy diet. This is a relevant message, and also in the current situation where we're seeing that poverty levels are increasing, it'll become even more difficult for people to have an adequate diet. I will conclude with some messages about what we can do with our food systems to provide food at a more accessible cost for most people. Our food systems in Latin America and the Caribbean are successful in the sense that they can provide healthy diets to people who can afford it. We all know there's gourmet stores where that food is available. We're a region that's rich in biodiversity and food production, but unfortunately, this is not accessible for a lot of people. There's an important message, and your protagonist, as Octavio was saying, in the sense that the social protection systems, which are strong, and we have to recognize the value of and the role that we play in our region, not just governments, but the social protection networks, civil society organizations like yours. We believe we have to focus more from these social protection networks so that they introduce this element of the nutritional variable in their proposals. There is also the effect on changing habits, the behavior of the consumer. We know that the consumer has a responsibility. When they have the income, they can opt for healthier food combined with other healthy lifestyle habits, and, reduction in consumption of alcohol, smoking, etc. But we can also choose when it's possible for consumption habits, feeding habits that have a lower environmental footprint, a smaller environmental footprint. And this has to do with economic inclusion. And on the left side of the slide, I think we all agree that we need more policies, more public and private investment to improve the impact of nutrition in everything we do. As Octavio was saying, uh, better opportunities for small and mid-sized producers who are the providers of usually the most nutritional foods, freshest foods that can lead to a healthy diet. And obviously, we need to work on all the links of the distribution, the supply chain, so that that doesn't include only the small and medium-sized producers who produce healthy food, but so that transportation, storage, distribution is much more efficient in environmental terms, in terms of reducing waste and also protecting this small and medium-sized producers. Now, following on Octavio's message about the great opportunity that you as members of this network of food banks have now to make, in fact, that the food system is more just, is more sustainable, is more inclusive, and that it guarantees the access to food, hopefully to healthy food, to people who are going through hard times. And there's an urgent need to change our food system so that they provide this healthy food, sustainable, healthy diets. So we count on you because you're critical actors so that this becomes a reality. So we need to work not only now during the pandemic, but over the next few years so that the food system becomes a part of the solution and not a problem when we have to guarantee healthy food for the most vulnerable groups of our population. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we're going now to questions and answers. Thank you. Ana, we can't hear you. At least I cannot hear you.
Gracias. Laura, Octavio, Ricardo, gracias por estas presentaciones.
Thank you, Laura, Octavio, and Ricardo, for your presentations. I don't know about the attendees, but I think it was very moving. I've been working in issues of food safety, nutritional safety, poverty, extreme poverty for 18 years. And this feeling of losing this work that we have done for 10 or 20 years in Latin America, this is devastating. So I want to start with a question. We call poorologists here in Colombia, and we have this question. As Ricardo said, it took 20 to 30 years through public policy and investment to get to this point. How long is it going to take us to recover all this time we have lost in terms of employment, of the food system, protection system, the hunger issue? I don't know if there's an estimation. I don't know if anybody would like to answer. Thank you, Ana, for your question. Really, in terms of employment, that's going to depend a lot on how long the recession would be in the future. The estimation is that it will be pretty long, at least 2020, 2021 is going to take some time to recover all this jobs, but it's going to depend on public policy. It's going to depend on what sectors are more affected than others. Some countries, for example, are focused a lot on tourism, and this is going to take longer because there's an issue of personal behavior. People maybe will hesitate to go back to that industry, and I don't know. I don't know if we will recover in how many years the levels of employment that we'd had, but there are some transcendental challenges as far as employment that have to do with productivity, with informal jobs. It's not just recovering the jobs that we had before, but how can we transcend that and do the reforms and have incentives so that we have a market that has a better coverage of those poverty, hunger, health risks. Thank you, Laura. This is a very important subject. I would like to go back now, which is the reason, one of the reasons for inviting you here is that we would like to go deeper into the issue of the informal economy, informal employment, because it's a cycle. Informal employment, poverty, hunger. That's an important perspective. Why, the loss of employment is so important, and the loss of employment in this informal economy, because one way or another, they increase the gap, the inequality. So, Octavio, did you want to share some of your vision or your idea of how long it would take? And Octavio, Ricardo, if you can comment on maybe what we could do to reduce that time, to decrease that time, to go back at least to the numbers we were dealing with before. I think we have this. I have this impression that we're all disconcerted. We're all. This is a new situation, and it hinges on the health issue, on the medical issues. If we will have a vaccine or not, treatment. So really, I think it's a global uncertainty. Nobody knows, and so it's very difficult to make predictions. So, like Laura, I think it's difficult to throw a number, say 5 years, 10 years. We don't have the data to make that estimation. And I believe that, and perhaps I'm repeating myself, but I think that in any case, the recovery, facing the crisis and then the post-pandemic phase, I think what governments do is important. But I think the key, it's a key role, the role of civil society. The governments have been knocked out. There's very low fiscal resources. They're overwhelmed by the health issues, what they need to invest in hospitals and health. So those are really huge numbers. So we won't solve this if we don't focus on this issue by connecting the work done by governments with the work done by uh, NGOs, cooperatives, the civil society, local banks. And what I'm seeing in Latin America is there's a lot of dynamism. The society has reacted. There's solidarity, there's food banks, and that's impressive. That's, I think, one of the few positive things that we can take out of this crisis. Thank you. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues are saying, but obviously we're all shocked. Predictions are not positive, and we don't dare say when this is going to change because we're right in the middle of the pandemic. So if this extends for a few more months, the crisis will be larger. Obviously, when we look at why the region advanced so quickly in the years that we were making progress, there was a combination of public policy, inclusion policies, and it was the civil society that put the double agenda on the table and forced their governments to implement these policies. And there was also a boom in the area of raw materials and the means to reduce inequality. But we know that this model is not too strong. It's pretty weak. Uh, it depends so much on the cost of raw materials, the issues with tourism. But I think we have a society that's more mature, and it's in a position where it can demand more from their governments. And I think that's a positive sign. We're in a better condition now, better situation, so that uh, the social and economic recovery will have a foundation of more of equality, or more equality, and I think you play a very important role. We need to guarantee that any model that gets us out of this in the future does not leave the people behind. Thanks, Ricardo. I know it's a complex, a difficult question because it's kind of a magical thing here. Laura, if we go back to the issue of the informal economy, if you can tell us about the analysis you made, the implications of having that informal economy, which is the most affected one, because as long as we have quarantines, we have lockdowns, obviously the most affected sector will be that those informal jobs, informal economy, the underground economy. Well, we see this strong impact on this informal economy. Many people who work in this sector live in poverty, and the combination of not having a regular income, working in the informal economy, and now in a situation where they don't have any savings in the family to cover their daily expenses. This is a worrisome situation. On the other hand, the informal worker did not have risk coverage. Mainly the most important risk now, the health risk. So to contract the virus without coverage, where you have to go to public health systems, this is a difficult situation. So for the future, we need to support in the short term these families so that they can have an income. But for the midterm, for the long term, we need to think about the social security, social safety nets in the region so that we can support people and families so that they can have this coverage. And a very high risk is the risk of poverty in old age. We know our region is aging. That's no news. It was a young region. Right now, we are seeing a lot of people aging in many countries in the region, and that's a risk that we face now. The risk of poverty in old age, and we're not ready to support people at that stage. We're going to be living longer. They're going to be more older adults, so that's concerning. So we have to, as I said, work in the short term to protect, to assist people so they can obtain an income, but we need to reform social security, social safety nets, so that in the future, when we have another shock, we will hopefully not have another pandemic like this one, but there's always shocks. There's always something that affects people, and we need to be prepared for that. Thank you very much, Laura, for your answer, because it's very important. A large percentage of the people that we attend to from the food banks is people working in this informal economy. You mentioned this in your presentations, in your answer. You mentioned getting ready, and I'm incorporating questions that I'm receiving now. And thanks to all the people doing this. Remember that you can include your questions. You can write your questions at the bottom. We will be answering live as long as we have the time. So you mentioned civil society. One of the more important strategic changes in moving from the Millennium Objectives to the Sustainable Development Objectives was that we understood that it was important to incorporate civil society and the corporations in this solution. That just putting this the responsibility for the solution on the government's shoulders was not enough. And there's a very complex question that I'm being asked here. Understanding this role of civil society, understanding that the objectives of sustainable development promote this association with civil society. Do you see the banks, the development, the FAO, can they leverage this association, this link with civil society? We understand that historically these associations have connected with governments, but with the new role that we're playing, food banks as part of organized civil society, do you see a possibility of a transition to retake the pace on this situation of extreme poverty, unemployment, hunger? I'm sorry, I know we're live, but well, of course, Ana, we have, let's say, first, when we're talking about food systems, to transform them to be more sustainable, I would say 99.9% of the actors who are part of the food system are private citizens. And I'm talking about not just the big companies, the small producer, the small corner store, it's a private dynamic. And we can understand this as social civil actors. Health organizations are also private. So trying to work with an organization like FAO to have a sustainable transformation of food systems without taking into account what the governments want, the civil actors, private actors of the food system, that would be naive if we don't bring them to the table, if we don't work with them. Any type of transformation that we could agree in a virtual workshop with governments will not be achievable. So yes, we have to, we have a new general director. He's been on for just 1 year. He has transformed the organization itself and the issues of alliances with the civil society, with the private sector. That's a priority in his agenda. We are the FAO. I don't think we're one of the United Nations agencies that has the most synergy. I think we're more open to working with private actors, but obviously we need to do it in a much better way. And I think there's a new internal policy for this association with the private sector because, as I said, it's not feasible to make any proposal a reality if we don't work with them. And I think this is going to happen to a greater extent in the next few months. We are, of course, revising internal regulations now so that we can make that interaction more possible. Of course, taking care of different interests, etc. And but we need to do that. If not, it's not going to be relevant in the midterm. We're going to be one of those organizations that just advise governments, but we don't have a foothold when we have to propose things that are more feasible. On behalf of the Inter-American Bank, please, Laura, thank you. The truth is that on the issue of employment specifically, we, on one side, the creators of employment are the largest ones are in the private sector. So that's part of the civil society. That means not only small companies, we're talking about small companies, small producers, retail, mom and pop, as they say, businesses, as they say in the US. All of that is the productive sector of the region. And we need to have this connection, and we have it with the private sector for the creation of employment. But the bank also, development bank also has done a revision of institutional strategy, and we are trying to reach civil society in a wider way so that we can carry out projects like Ricardo was saying that are more with a foot on the ground and more feasible, and when we can support the most vulnerable populations. Many organizations of civil society allows us to decrease those gaps, reduce inequality so that we can mitigate those risks and those problems that exist because many populations don't have access to employment and opportunities. A clear example is the job training services. That's something that's very important in our work agenda, how to change, how to have people increase their capacity so that they can obtain employment. And civil society, through different labor training services, they're very important. So definitely, we work a lot on that, and we want to continue being more effective in working with the civil society. Sorry.
Thank you, Laura. What I wanted to say, Anna, is that if we look at this from the public policy standpoint, when I say public policy, I really should talk about action public policy and what the state has to do. But just to simplify, public policy, the problem that I think we have is what to do in those countries, those sectors, those territories where the state is really fragile. And this is a problem that we've had for years before the crisis. And the countries owe a lot of money. They are subject now to a lot of pressure because of the health problem. But so what to do? And I work in the rural areas, and in the rural areas, we have a lot of territories in Latin America where the state is not present. You can't see it. So um, I would presume, or I would think it's the same, the urban sector, but I think the paradigm is changing. And I think that in those spaces where the state will not reach, those spaces are going to be filled by the by the civil society, the local communities, the co-ops, and I think there's also a central space for multilateral organisms, places like the UN. Um, the UN is mostly an institution that does studies, but the IBD, the FAO, those are agencies, institutions that are able to intervene. And I think that they will have to contribute, not just the UN, as I said, all these international networks are going to have to be there, because we have to remember that the the external entities interventions, entities like the UN or the international network, they they really help the implementation of public programs. I'm going to give you an example. For instance, a problem that is a recurrent problem in Latin America. It has to do with public policies and political cycles. You get a new government, all the policies change, and everything starts over. And we know the story, we know how it works. And in if there is an institution, an international entity, UN or otherwise, they would provide a way of providing stability. And I think it would be very efficient way of providing stability in our countries. So I think this is going to be a new paradigm where we have to find a new balance for the area. Thank you, Octavio. And of all the answers that you are providing, I think that you are answering some of the other questions that we had in the inbox. So what are the new paradigms? That was one of the questions. What are these new paradigms that definitely they are changing, and what are the things that are being rebuilt? Octavio talked about it during his presentation. Laura talked about it, and Ricardo also digitalization, employment, quality of employment, diet, yeah, so diet so that you have a stronger immune system so that you're ready for the next crisis. This is a living system. This is an organism. We're going to have to face a new crisis in the future. So we have to have diets that allow us to face that and to be better prepared for it. I'm going to close with the final question that I think is really interesting, especially as I mentioned before, we have food banks, we have businesses, we have colleges, universities, um, community organizations that we work with. We've had about 200 people listening to us today and sharing these sustainable development goals. This new paradigm, um, this changed our goals, definitely. It also changed our time frame. 2030 now sounds like around the corner. 2030 is now. So what do you think is next when we're talking about the sustainable development goals? Are we thinking of reformulating those? And what is our role in the civil society, according to what you consider? What is our role as food banks in this new formulation of the SDGs? And I mean, is the time frame changing? Are the indicators changing? Because we would expect for countries to really reformulate the priorities for this sustainable development goals. And for we had a number of indicators for these SDGs, and there were internal indicators. Every country had to individually decide what goals they were going to try to reach and how they were going to do it, how they were going to get to 2030. So this is a new reality. And so we have to face employment, economy, poverty. So how do you see from your own institutions what's going on? From the bank, honestly, we are we're really worried. We've been shaken as an institution. We had goals, we had proposals, but now we say, well, facing this new reality, this unprecedented shock, how can the bank react so that things are done in a different way, faster, more agile? And we want to provide support faster. Uh, we want to work quickly with all of the multilateral institutions. I imagine it's the same for everybody. We want to make sure we can have this support reach the countries, both fiscal support, program support. We want to be there. So it's always a concern. How are we going to reach the goals that we had established before? How are we going to do it in the short time that we have left now? So we're really working hard to try to say, okay, given this new problem and the unexpected magnitude of this problem, how can every sector, in my case, it's labor markets, but for every sector in the bank, how can we be more efficient or effective to help to deliver resources faster, to provide technical assistance? And there are things like what you were saying, things that were happening before. Digitalization was one of them. The region is moving forward slowly, I would say, but this is a reality. This is a necessity. This is an imperative. We need to resolve the issue of connectivity, digitalization of services, remote work. These are things that we need to work on right now. So we need to think of how to reformulate the SDGs and how to reach that. There's time to do that. But right now, the urgent preoccupation that we have is how to help people, how to reach those households that have no income, how to reduce inequality. And we are already detecting this by seeing the unequal effects of this pandemic. I'm sorry that I don't really have a clear answer, but we're really working hard on the here and now. No, thank you, Laura, because I think that is, I think that's a reminder that we're still in the midst of the crisis, and every time that a government decides to go back to a quarantine or lockdown, we go back to the crisis, because the crisis is not just the pandemic itself, but also the decision to go back to a quarantine, because that affects, of course, the food systems and the economy in every country. Thank you, Ricardo. Well, look, I think uh, it may sound very obvious, but this pandemic, beyond the very important things that we're looking at right now, the loss of lives and the images that we're going to be looking at in the short term, the poverty and vulnerability of all types, I think that if we look at the agenda, the 2030 agenda, and the public agenda, at the end of the day, we shouldn't forget that this pandemic, it's it's a sustainability problem, environmental sustainability problem that makes it possible for this, that is basically an animal disease, to jump into humans in a different environment. This shouldn't have happened. So this is something that's going to happen. It's going to happen very often now, even more often as we develop these new development models that are not sustainable, talking about the environment, talking about socially or financially. So in that regard, this is a call to action. This is something that we need to pay attention to. So this is a call of attention for the world economy, something that we need to look at. This is something that we saw in movies, in Netflix shows before, but this is happening now. And this is because of lack of sustainability for the whole planet. And from the food standpoint in our region, and we were talking about obesity and overweight people, but there has to be, this is a human right to nutrition. Nutrition is a human right, and health is another human right. And obviously, the pandemic makes us think of that. The next right is, after your right to health, there's the right to food. You have this informal economy, and at the very least, they need to have a basic basket with basic food. So this right that we thought had been agreed upon, something that we thought had been solved, the civil society, the government, the private sector had worked on that. But I think this comes back to being a priority. And we're not just talking about hunger, obesity. These are just the two faces of the same coin. We have these poor people, vulnerable populations. They have no choice but to eat badly. And so they're obese, but they're malnourished at the same time, and they have no choices. So this is something that is an important message, that the way we consume food, and it needs to change from the production on, all the different phases of food production. And as consumers, we also have to look at the way we consume. So even though it may seem a very natural or basic message, I think in terms of the 2030 agenda, the messages, the goals are very relevant right now. But the vision that these objectives promote, we do have to keep them in mind even more clearly now than before. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for talking about the human right to nutrition, I think, or food. I think now more than ever, it is a strategy to really understand what is nutrition, and it should be a fundamental human right in every country. Thank you so much, Ricardo and Octavio. Just to finish for today, to end, anything that you have to contribute to this conversation? I'm going to talk to you on behalf of Octavio Sotomayor, just as a person. And my impression is that high level, the General Secretary and the UN and the different international response. I think we've been hit very hard. There's a lot of desperation. And I think it's important to say that even before this crisis, the SDG number 2, hunger, there were clear indications that we were not going to reach that for 2030, and it's become even more clear now with this crisis. So I don't know what the official position is. Something that has already said we're going to reformulate the SDGs. I don't know, just heard mentions, but everything indicates that we're in trouble. And the second part of what I wanted to say is I'm convinced that this crisis, and I will insist again, all the trends pre-crisis indicated the same thing, but the crisis itself sort of stresses the same problems. We have to evolve. We have to evolve towards a new paradigm where we are looking also for different ways of collaboration. The state is always important, of course. If you look at literature, when you do a review, there are experts that analyze what happens in Africa, for instance, what happens in certain Latin American countries where things are really convoluted. And the conclusion is state is always important. And that's clear. And that's very important. But under those extreme circumstances, when you have violence, when you have corruption, when you have climate disasters, when you have a fragile state, I think it's really important in that case to think of different ways of collaborating where there is a new protagonic role for companies, businesses, or entities such as yours, like food banks. So we need to find a new balance, and perhaps something good's going to come out at the end of all this. You always have to be optimistic. Okay, Laura, Ricardo, Octavio, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you so much for this process, this learning process, and this opportunity to share with us. And we've been working with FAO, with Inter-American Bank, and this is a process that will continue when facing the challenges that we're facing. Food banks will continue our work to support and to work both with the communities and businesses with whom we have partnerships. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors. Without this would not be possible. General Mills, Lala, HEB, Ingredient, all these businesses that have made this possible. And tomorrow we will send a recording of this session, and I wish you all, in the middle of the circumstances, I wish the best for you and your families. Thank you. Thank you.